President Trump has made a number of statements that the United States is going to be there in Venezuela to govern Venezuela for years on end. If we get into a similar situation in which we're somehow bogged down, that will absolutely detract from U.S. capabilities in the Indo-Pacific. It probably emboldens China more than it imposes caution on them. And on top of Venezuela, President Trump continues to make statements about Greenland. And for the first time, I think since World War II, basically, some European countries has declared the United States to be a primary security threat.
Welcome to APARC Briefing. My name is Kiyoteru Tsutsui, and I'm the director of the Stanford University's Shorenstein Asia-Pacific Research Center. Today, as the world continues to respond to what happened in Venezuela on January 3rd, here at APARC Briefing, we are going to discuss the military strategic implications of what happened in Venezuela for the Indo-Pacific region, in particular China, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, and so on. And for that, I am delighted to be joined today by Oriana Skylar Mastro, who will help us make sense of the strategic aspects of the operation in Venezuela. Just briefly, Oriana is a dear colleague of ours at the Freeman Spogler Institute for International Studies. She is a center fellow there and an APARC faculty affiliate. She's also a courtesy assistant professor of political science, all at Stanford University. She is a leading expert on Chinese military and security policy, Asia-Pacific security issues, war termination, and coercive diplomacy. And her numerous publications include the most recent book, Upstart: How China Became a Great Power, which evaluates China's approach to great power competition. She also continues to serve in the United States Air Force Reserve, for which she currently works at the Pentagon as Deputy Director of Reserve Global China Strategy, and she is kindly joining us from an undisclosed location in Europe where she is right now. And here we should emphasize that what Oriana is going to say is in her private capacity and does not reflect the views of U.S. military. So Oriana, thank you so much for joining us. You are a Shohei Ohtani overall, playing two ways in academia and in the military. And your perspective is very highly valued. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So let's start with your initial reaction to what happened in Venezuela. What were your thoughts, especially as you look to the event's implications for Asia?
So I have, multiple levels of response to what happened in Venezuela. It is surprising for a number of reasons. It has implications on many different levels for the Indo-Pacific. So let me just start from the most basic of the military operations, and we'll work our way up to the strategic. So operationally, what happened in Venezuela, right? You had this very sort of surgical, direct attack situation in which the United States flew in approximately 150 aircraft to neutralize Venezuelan air defenses. And this allowed then the United States to insert troops into the capital via helicopter, who then took the Venezuelan president, brought him back to the United States for a trial on drug charges. Now, the most important aspect of this operation is, as a China specialist, someone who focuses on military strategy in China and potential contingencies vis-a-vis the Chinese. I mean, Kyo, if only the United States could do something like this in Asia, but not possible, okay? The bottom line, against China, has the most sophisticated air defense systems in the world. We cannot get a carrier anywhere near China because they can sink it. We can't get aircraft near China because they'll shoot them down. So there's no situation in which we neutralize Chinese air defenses and then somehow did some sort of infiltration. If anyone who reads the news have often seen that there are weeks on end in which we don't even know where Xi Jinping is. We're like, where did the defense minister go? Where did Xi Jinping go? So this type of operation, I don't want our listeners to get the impression, yes, it was awesome. The U.S. military is great, but this is not the type of thing that we could do in the Indo-Pacific against China. So the first level of implications, it doesn't really tell us a lot operationally about what is capable, what the United States is capable of in a contingency via China. Leaving aside also the fact that all of this requires extensive use of U.S. space assets that the Chinese could disrupt and that we can't defend against Chinese attacks. So that's a whole separate thing. But for me, on the strategic level, it has some serious implications because some of our listeners might have taken the time to read the Trump administration's new national security strategy. And in that strategy, they lay very clearly that the Western Hemisphere is going to be the priority. Now, for me as a China specialist, I was really, excited when in the past administration, not only the first Trump administration, but then the Biden administration, really laid out the fact that the pacing threat was China and that, even those who might have disagreements over the degree to which China is threatening, I think even, Kiyo, you work on Japan, we could all agree that the most important region to U.S. interest is the Indo-Pacific, right? And we have waited our turn for decades and decades for that to be the strategic focus of the United States. And then all of a sudden, we have this shift in which we're no longer all of a sudden focused on the Indo-Pacific, but we're focused on the Western Hemisphere. Now, this was very surprising to me when I read this the first time, because of all the regions in the world, first and foremost, the Western Hemisphere, while it's very important to the United States because it's close to home, we have no threat of losing our dominance in the Western Hemisphere, right? It's not like that, the United States remains the dominant power there with defense spending dwarfing any state in the region. And if we're looking at China, of all the regions in the world, China is the least militarily active in Central and South America, right? They have created military organizations for Central Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. But they only have, one smaller informal regional organization in Latin America. And, for many of our allies in the Indo-Pacific, China is their top trading partner, whereas the U.S. remains the top export destination for most Latin American and South American countries. And so in the context of this strategic outlook and this shift, on one hand, you might have read that national security strategy and said, okay, fine, but this is just a strategy. It's just in writing. It doesn't mean anything. But for me, one of the most impactful things about Venezuela and the fact that then the United States conducted this operation there suggests that the Trump administration means business about this renewed focus on the Western Hemisphere. And unfortunately, that makes me concerned that there might be strategic neglect of the Indo-Pacific moving forward.
Great, thank you. I would imagine President Xi knows that something like this operation could not be carried out against China specifically, so he's not necessarily shaking in his boots. And you laid out the strategic implications of this as the United States focuses on Western Hemisphere. Now, more specifically about this operation, what it signifies toward China's potential intentions toward Taiwan. Let's focus on that topic right now. Does this operation serve as more of as a deterrent, demonstrating to China that the U.S. is capable of carrying out complex operations like this one when the United States deems them necessary? Or does it embolden China by enabling President Xi to justify aggressions in Taiwan in terms of the international law and international norms, as it set a precedent for its actions in its own sphere of influence?
So on the surface, at the very least, the Chinese are leveraging this operation as a win in terms of legitimacy, discourse power for China. There have been a lot of op-eds, political cartoons that have been pushed out by the Chinese that are arguing that the United States has no respect for sovereignty, right, and international law. So these sort of cartoons demonstrate, there's one very famous one that was circulating of the Statue of Liberty sort of stepping on and crushing, a tombstone that was about like sovereignty and international law, carrying automatic weapons and all this sort of stuff to say, listen, if it's normative power that we're talking about, that the United States is going to convince the world in the case of a Chinese mainland attack, on Taiwan, that mainland China or the PRC is illegitimate in using force to achieve their goals, then that's going to be a very difficult position for the United States to take. As in the case of Venezuela, for example, the United States used force to achieve its goals against what is considered by all states in the international system as a sovereign nation. While Taiwan is not considered a sovereign nation by the vast majority of states in the international system. So it's already a gray area. And then you have on top of it that the United States has sort of disregarded, the international law about legitimacy of use of force against other countries. So it's definitely like a diplomatic win for the Chinese, a discourse win for the Chinese. Now, in terms of how they actually think about it versus how they're trying to spin it, this is much more of a trade-off type of situation. On one hand, right now, the way that it went down, what the United States did in Venezuela does not have a significant impact on U.S. capabilities in the Indo-Pacific. But President Trump has made a number of statements that the United States is going to be there in Venezuela to govern Venezuela for years on end. If we get into a similar situation in which we're somehow bogged down and a lot of resources, attention, and priorities are focused on this, that will absolutely detract from U.S. capabilities in the Indo-Pacific, just like Afghanistan did, just like Iraq did. Now, I don't get me wrong, we are not there right now, but based on some of the things that have been said, it's possible that we get there. Now, in terms of how the Chinese take U.S. capabilities, I will say that, again, what we did there doesn't really tell you a lot about what the United States is capable of in a more traditional interstate conflict that involves land and sea more than anything. But the Chinese have always been very impressed with this special operations capability of the United States. It's actually one of the few areas that if you look at Chinese writings, when the United States goes in to save hostages, for example, that China doesn't criticize the United States for the use of those forces, but instead has kind of a deep admiration for what they're capable of. So there's always the logical, this shouldn't really impact how they think about the United States. But as we all know, countries are made out of people. There's always the perceptions as well that this was an extraordinarily successful attack. It also demonstrated the will of the United States to use force when it deemed necessary. But generally speaking, if I had to weigh all these factors against each other, I would say that it probably emboldens China more than it imposes caution on them.
Oh, that's an excellent analysis. Thank you for that. China's reaction to this, Chinese government put out some statements largely critical of U.S.'s operation in Venezuela. What should we look for in the next weeks and months in terms of China's statements and reactions and actions that would reflect China's views on Venezuela?
Well, I think the first question is how much, are the Chinese really going to try to leverage this for their own benefit? Or is it just kind of like they saw that immediate propaganda win and then they leave it at that? One of the things I'll be looking at, for example, is that Xi Jinping has decided he wants to be the leader of the developing world. And they've made a lot of efforts to make inroads in places in Africa and Latin America, the Middle East, according to this logic of you have these imperialist nations like the United States that do not respect the interests or unique characteristics of other countries. China understands these countries. We listen to some of this rhetoric. We think it's very heavy-handed, but I've been a part of some of these government meetings with the Chinese and developing nations, and I will tell you that it resonates with a lot of them. So I'll be interested to see how much then 6 months from now, it'll be 6 months when they have their annual meeting of defense ministers, for example, in Beijing. In October of 2026, are they going to be talking about Venezuela? Like, are they going to take this as this talking point to help them gain more ground vis-a-vis those developing countries? I'll be interested also, that would be more on the public scale when they also have all those multilateral regional organizations I referred to before. How much are they sitting there with the South Africans talking about Venezuela, right? So are they going to use it to gain ground with the developing countries, but are they also going to use it to gain ground with U.S. allies and partners? So one of the many interesting things about Chinese strategy is while the United States, we face certain crises, we tend to go to our allies and partners for support. But China also goes to US allies and partners to then pressure the United States to do things that China deems necessary. So historically, especially in conflict times, China will go to US allies and partners and say, the United States is being irrational about this, they're being aggressive. You need to convince the United States to not do these things, or else it's bad for all of us. And so in addition to looking at their rhetoric in these sort of regional forum, when I talk to our allies and partners, as you mentioned, I'm in Europe right now, so I'm doing a lot of engagement with NATO, with AFRICOM, doing a lot of engagement with our European allies and partners, which has been great, by the way, because I speak 3 European languages, of which I've never used any of them in work until now. So it doesn't feel like a complete waste of my skill set. But in talking to these European countries, I'm going to be curious in their private bilateral discussions with the Chinese, are the Chinese saying, listen, you don't want to put your eggs in the US basket. This is no longer you're friends with China for economic reasons. You need the United States for security guarantees. The United States is a security threat. And on top of Venezuela, President Trump continues to make statements about Greenland. And for the first time, I think since World War II, basically, some European countries has declared the United States to be a primary security threat. So I am curious to see if the Chinese try to bring along the Venezuela case as well to convince U.S. allies and partners, to distance themselves from the United States, which would have significant, repercussions for the global order and for the United States' role within it.
That's a very revealing and somewhat scary observation that those whispers by the Chinese government going to resonate a little bit more, whispers of US being the security threat in the region. Now, turning to US allies in Asia, similar dynamics, right, seem to be taking place. And especially with the US seeming to turn its back on the liberal, rule-based international order. So what should US allies in the region, such as South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, Australia, maybe we'd include Taiwan there, what should they do in this brave new world where military power seems to be the only language that is understood? A lot of them, those countries are expanding under pressure from President Trump as well, but also just expanding their military capacity, seeing what's going on around them. And some of them are even talking about, if not seriously considering, obtaining nuclear capacity, nuclear weapons capacity. What would be your advice to US allies in the region?
So, Q, it's interesting. You mentioned in the beginning of this talk that I have kind of those dual hats or dual careers as a Stanford professor and also, in the US military. And I'm obviously here in my civilian capacity, but I'd like to be very honest about my own thoughts and biases. Like as an academic, my role in the US government does not influence my research or my research findings or things of that sort. But different academics have different views about the policy relevance of their research. And in particular, the degree to which they feel comfortable with governments, whether they be the US government or other governments, using their research to promote governmental ends. So along those lines, I do feel like, while I translate my research into policy, I'm maybe a bit more careful about the policy implications that I publish and the ones that maybe while they exist for my research, I sort of keep silent on. So I say that because what do I honestly think US allies and partners should do, and what am I trying to convince them to do are maybe two separate things. And in particular, I have a bit of wishful thinking about this issue, and that I hear a lot from the region, whether it's the Indo-Pacific or Europe, like this is it, right? Like the Trump administration has gone too far. I mean, I'm not just talking about Venezuela, but across the board of how the Trump administration is sort of cozying up to Russia, seems not to care about Taiwan, like doesn't seem to have the back of our allies and partners, and that this is going to be the end of the post-World War II, U.S.-led international order and the U.S. alliances. And I honestly believe I'm kind of like, I mean, I've heard this before. It seems like a relationship in which we've been married for decades, and every couple of years you tell me you want a divorce, but I know you're not going anywhere. I mean, where do you have to go? Like, I'm your best option, you know? So it's hard for me to believe that allies and partners really have alternatives. And you hear it sometimes, like you were referring to, what the Europeans call strategic autonomy. Like, they're going to build up their military so that they have more autonomy. And I try to remind US strategists who have, for example, as you mentioned, pressured our allies and partners to build more, that, you know, the reason Japan doesn't have a huge military or France doesn't have a huge military is not because historically they refused to do so, but because that was the US preference. Because we have leverage when countries need us. And so now there's this push for the desire for autonomy, and the United States might not like it when countries have more autonomy to make the decisions that they would otherwise, you know, not make if they were so reliant on the United States. So what I try to tell allies and partners is, listen, you don't have a lot of better options. If you look at the threats that are out there, and this is much more the case for Indo-Pacific countries than it is for European countries. And in a March Senate testimony, I highlighted this. European allies have much more of a capability to counter Russia on their own than Asian allies have to counter China. One, because European allies are more militarily capable, they have more resources, and the Russian threat does not compare to the Chinese threat. So it's different on both sides. But what I would tell Asian allies is, like, you don't really have an option. That Chinese military, you know, if it gives the United States problems, it definitely gives you problems, right? There's no hope for a country like Taiwan without the United States. There's no hope for Australia without the United States. So you know, you need the United States. And so the advice I give is, if you are concerned that the United States is acting in an aggressive way, one of the main reasons the United States is acting that way is an insecurity about our place in the Indo-Pacific and the balance of power with China. So while it seems counterintuitive as such a strong nation, it seems to me that the United States also needs to be reassured. We need to be reassured that our allies and partners support us, will be there for us, will allow, you know, to give us what we need to succeed in the competition and conflict with China. And if we had that confidence, maybe the United States would be less provocative or less aggressive in its use of military force. So that is my diplomatic line of what I tell allies and partners. It's really hard. You know, I can see that the value of U.S. partnership is decreasing. I really do sort of half believe, half hope. You know, they always say hope's not a strategy, but sometimes it's all we have. That, you know, once President Trump leaves, just like the region really suffered in the Bush years, and we had very little influence, especially in Southeast Asia. When President Obama came in, the Chinese in particular were extremely surprised with how quickly the United States was able to regain its position in the region, that the region wanted us there. And then, you know, once we were willing to engage, they welcomed us back. So my hope is that, you know, once you have a new president, hopefully a new strategic direction, we can, you know, convince countries that 4 years, 8 years was an anomaly, and now we're going a different direction, and we can easily rebuild what we've lost. But, you know, honestly speaking, it's really hard to tell if that's going to be a possibility in the future.
Thank you, Oriana, for joining us and sharing your insights about the situation in Venezuela and in our reaction to it in Europe as well as in Asia. Thank you for watching, and see you next time at APARC Briefing.